Howdy, welcome to another week of Canon Calls. I am your host, Jake McAtee, and this week I'm excited that we got a hold of Dr. Tom Shippey, who is one of the world's leading Tolkien scholars. He was on to talk about his book on Vikings. It's titled Laughing Shall I Die? Lives and Deaths of the Great Vikings. You can find it on Amazon or anywhere you get your books. The interview today will obviously be an introduction to that book, but I also highly recommend the YouTube channel Epic History. They did a great little brief animation of the Vikings that Dr. Shippey talks about in the book. So, without further ado, meet Dr. Tom Shippey. All right, now welcoming on special guest, Dr. Tom Shippey, author of many books, one of my favorite reads on the subject of Tolkien, and he is on today to talk about a book called Laughing Shall I Die? Mr. Shippey, thank you so much for giving us your time.
Good. Well, glad to talk to you, Jake.
Fantastic. So, Laughing Shall I Die? Lives and Deaths of the Great Vikings. Is this a history? What were you doing with this book?
Well, I certainly was not trying to write a history of the Vikings, and there's two reasons for that. One is that there's good histories already, and I'd like to recommend the most recent one, which is by Professor Neil Price, and it's called The Children of Ash and Elm.
Okay.
Well, that's an excellent history, and I wouldn't wish to compete with it. But the other reason, actually, Professor Price points it out. He reminds us that we might talk about histories of the Vikings, but in a way, they're all written from the outside. They say you can't have a history without documents and dates, and we don't have any Viking documents written by Vikings in the Viking Age. And the reason's obvious. Vikings couldn't write. Only short runic inscriptions, which don't help us at all. And the other thing is that they never knew what date it was. They didn't have a dating system. They might say, oh, it was the 8th year of King Olaf. But if you didn't know when the first year of King Olaf was, you're none the wiser.
Right.
So really, our whole Viking history, in the sense of a timeline and a chronology, is put together from the reports of the Vikings' many victims.
Okay.
And we have those really running from west to east in Old Irish, in Old English, in Latin from all over Europe, in Byzantine Greek, in Old Church Slavonic from Russia, in Arabic from Moorish Spain, and from the Caliphate of Baghdad. And all these people could write, and they wrote things down very often as they happened. And of course, they always knew what date it was. They had a dating system or dating systems, which we understand perfectly well. So really, our history of the Vikings is put together from foreign sources. It's kind of history from the outside. And I didn't want to do that. I was really much more interested in trying to get at the inside. So in brief, what I was trying to do was to explore the Viking mindset. And we have a lot of information about that in sagas and in poems. But of course, as I've just said, they weren't written down at the time. They were written down, well, anything over 150 years after the end of the Viking Age. And so, in a way, they're not historical documents, but they do provide us evidence of, what the Viking stories were, what people thought about them, how they reacted. It's kind of an image of Viking culture. So basically, that was my aim. I was trying to explore the Viking mindset from the inside, not the outside.
Before I ask you about that mindset, when we think of Vikings, so when I got the book and when I was essentially reading your book, I have in mind the hats, long blonde hair, maybe. Am I in the right imaginative realm? Do you have thoughts about that?
Well,
is that a Hollywood faux pas?
I'm trying not to say the word no, Jake. but one of the problems that academics have felt for a long time now is that the Vikings have a very clear brand image.
Right.
Which we all understand. It's horned helmets and it's berserkers and it's blood eagles And it's, I'm trying to think what the other cliches are, but you know them all. They're quite familiar from film and TV and so on.
Right.
And much of it is wrong, and some of it's just plain wrong.
Okay.
And some of it is, shall we say, exaggerated. People have been trying, as I say, for a long time to get away from the romantic image and replace it with something more realistic.
Okay.
So there's a hurdle to get over at the start.
Sure. Okay. So then tell us about this mindset. What is it about these people that fascinated you enough to set pen to paper?
As my book title suggests, Laughing Shall I Die? And, the subtitle is Lives and Deaths of the Great Vikings, but I actually wanted it the other way around. I wanted it to be Deaths and Lives of the Great Vikings, but the publisher said, oh, no, that's the wrong way around. So they got their way and I didn't. But the two themes then, as in the title, are fascination with death and scenes of death and famous last words and famous last stands and all that kind of thing. And there's also, of course, laughter, comedy. And that is something which people have not been so ready to spot.
And then in terms of the death, it seems like today that couldn't be more of a reversal in terms of, us living the longest. That doesn't seem familiar to me as a baseline. What about death? Why death? Why were they into death and not life forever?
Well, this is a question which struck everyone, right at the start when the whole of the saga literature started to be rediscovered. Long ago in the 1600s, there was a guy who wrote a book in Latin, which translates out as something like, on the causes of the contempt for death felt by the Danes who were still pagan. And this guy, his Latin name is Bartholinus, he was really called Bertelsen, he was a Swede. He just did a kind of compendium of great death scenes which he picked from the literature. And his explanation was a very simple one, which people have actually been ready to believe. He said Vikings were not afraid of death because they believed in Valhalla.
Okay.
They thought that if they died in battle, if they died sword in hand, then they would go to Valhalla, where they would feast with Odin. And that's an explanation which has been readily accepted, but I don't believe it. In the first place, we've got very little evidence for it, just a few hints here and there. And in the second place, actually, I don't think belief in life after death is actually a terribly good morale builder. Lots of people now believe in life after death, but it doesn't actually hearten you when you're facing up to people coming at you with great big axes.
Right.
So I think there has to be some other explanation why they were so fascinated with the moments of the end of life. I think that Vikings had a very different attitude from ours to winning and losing. And to us, well, we've been influenced, I think, by centuries of competitive games. And you know how games work. There's even numbers on each side. You have a flat pitch. You change ends at halftime in case there's an advantage in the pitch. You toss up with a coin for choice of ends at the start. And there's a referee or an umpire to make certain that the rules are observed. So in our system, if you lose all the time, well, there's something wrong with you, isn't there? It's your fault. You can't blame anyone else.
Right.
Well, Vikings were a lot more realistic. They knew that in the heroic life, there weren't any referees, and there wasn't any flat playing pitch either. And it wasn't designed to be fair. So even heroes, one day, they were going to be outnumbered, taken off guard, caught by surprise, betrayed, let down, something or other would happen. And so if you lost, well, we're all going to lose. We're all going to lose sometime. And where you really show what you're made of is when you've lost. It's your attitude, as it were, at the moment of death. When you actually know it's hopeless and you know you're going to die and you don't give in. That's the important thing. That's what makes the hero. So actually, the way we talk, calling someone a loser, I don't think that would kind of mean much to them. They'd say, well, of course, that's what happens, isn't it? And you could also say that their whole mythology was pessimistic. The world is going to end at Ragnarok, and the gods and the humans would fight on one side, and the giants and the monsters would fight on the other side, and the giants and the monsters were going to win.
Right.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean you're going to change sides, does it? Because actually, that's when you show what you're worth. That's when you show what you're made of. So I think their ideology, you might say, braced them or prepared them for the moment when it comes to an end. And that, as I say, is when you show how good you are. You can't be a hero unless you actually lose and die. That's when you show what you're really like. That, I think, is why they're fascinated by scenes of heroic death. That was a major part of their ideology.
Right. The particular glory in fighting that losing battle, essentially, and doing so bravely. I have a question, if you don't mind doing a jaunt quick over to Tolkien. You describing, even in your book, I had this thought of, I've always kind of seen Tolkien as seeing a kind of glory in fighting the long defeat. Just having that air about his books, he's I believe someone said, only Tolkien could make going to heaven so sad in The Return of the King. But do you think he shares some of that? Do you think he's pulling from that kind of, at least some of that glory, similar to the Vikings? Not entirely, of course, but
I think Tolkien obviously understood it very well.
Okay.
He was steeped in the literature. But of course, he was also, as we all know, a believing Catholic.
Right.
So he regarded it in a rather more detached way. But I think what he perhaps got from the literature was, I would say, something like a sense of loss. There's a lot of things that get lost. The Lord of the Rings actually does not really have a happy ending.
Right.
Because everybody knows that things will not be the same. The elves are going to go away. The Ents will become extinct. The hobbits will vanish, and so on. So it's very much, it's not a completely happy ending.
Right.
And I think Tolkien is very good at blending his own belief with the archaic beliefs which he knew about.
Ent wives are never found.
Exactly. That's right. That's something which isn't going to happen. Yeah. Okay.
So in terms of, that was their sort of ideology of losing, which is totally foreign to ours. Can you tell us about their attitude towards laughter, sort of the other half of your title?
Well, that's rather more personal. As I say, the attraction to scenes of death was noticed long, long ago. People have been more reluctant to sort of see the idea of humor. And of course, there's a reason for that. They tell me, if you go on a dating site these days, one of the things you're supposed to put down is GSOH, good sense of humor. And of course, I think there's an opposite to that, and it's BSOH, bad sense of humor. And I'm afraid Viking humor is characteristically cruel. It's kind of, the Germans distinguish laughing, Gegenanderlachen, that's laughing at someone, from laughing with someone. And actually, that's not quite right, because Vikings are quite capable of laughing at themselves. I think I once summed it up in a little syllogism, which again is bad sense of humor. Hurting people is funny. People hurting is funny. And the funniest thing of all is when you hurt yourself. Yeah, well, this takes a bit to get over, but it's not all that unfamiliar, even in the modern world. Okay. It's just that it's not kind of authorized. And it's the kind of thing where people, especially academics in faculty clubs, you tell them the joke and they look at you and they say, I don't think that's funny.
Right.
Yeah, right. Well, if you can't take a joke, you shouldn't be in Viking studies, is what I say.
So I feel like if I were to have heard you say, well, they had a bad sense of humor, I'm naturally going to think you mean that they don't have one at all. But that's not the case. They do have one. They just, what they find funny is not really, as you mentioned, authorized today. What's an example of what you mean?
Well, the classic example, which I'm sorry, I'm kind of giggling as I say it. In the Jomsvikinga saga, the Jomsvikings, who are a bunch of professional Vikings, they fight a battle against Jarl Håkon and his son Jarl Erik, and they lose. And the survivors lined up on a log to have their heads cut off. Okay, but the Jomsvikings have a legal code, And one of the things is you must never show signs of fear. So one of the Vikings, when it comes to his turn, he says, I'm not going to kneel down and be beheaded. I'm going to stand up, and I want someone to cut me down from the front. And I want you all to look at me and see if I flinch. So they do. And he doesn't flinch. And then another one comes along and he says, well, I'll kneel down, fair enough. But look, I don't want my hair to get bloody. So I'll kneel down and I want someone to pull my hair back over my head so that my neck is bare. And then you can cut my head off. So, and he said, oh, and another thing, I don't want this done by a thrall. It must be a proper warrior who's holding my hair. So they say, well, okay, that's reasonable enough. And he kneels down and gets ready to have his head cut off with his hair pulled over his head. And as the axe falls, he jerks his head back. And it cuts off the hands of the guy who's holding his hair. Now, that's really funny, isn't it? Well, obviously they thought so.
Right.
Because Jarl Erik, who is supervising, he said, well, good for you. Yeah, that was so good. We'll let you off. You don't need to have your head cut off. And then there's further byplay. And in the end, the few remaining Jomsvikings are all freed and are not executed. But that kind of cruel practical joke, that's, I think, one of the things that they thought was funny. Obviously, it's not funny for the guy who got his hands cut off. But, well, I just have to leave you to decide whether you think that's funny or not. But that is bad sense of humor. Got it. And you give that guy some time, in a few years, maybe he will also, get the joke. Well, get that's the joke. Right. As soldiers say nowadays, again, why did you join up if you can't take a joke?
Okay, so as you're going through all of these stories, how do you treat this? Is this fact, or are you treating myths? How do you approach these studies? Well, of course, it's all mixed up. We have various different kinds of sagas. We have sagas of Icelanders, which are pretty realistic, actually, because they're Icelanders writing about people who are still well known. You also have king sagas, which are pretty heavily historical, and people rely on them a lot. But you also have what they call fornaldarsaga, which is sagas of old time. And frankly, these are often romances or even fairy tales. There's a strong fairy tale element in them. Dragons and werebears and witch women and elf women and that sort of thing. So, you have to sort of try and filter it out. There is a strong element of fiction, but I think there's also some element in there of fact. I'll give you a couple of examples, shall I? Please. One of the famous scenes, and it's the one that gave me the book title, when the famous Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, which means Ragnar hairy trousers, he's captured by King Ella of Northumbria, and King Ella decides to make an example of him, and he has him killed by throwing him into a snake pit, where he's bitten to death by the poisonous snakes. Well, the scene itself is famous, and it gave rise to a famous poem, The Death Song of Ragnar, which, and the last words of that are actually, Playandi Skalik Deya, laughing shall I die. That's where I got my title from. But a question which always struck me is, throw him in a snake pit. Where did he get the snakes from? The only poisonous snakes in England or Scotland are adders. And I'm very familiar with adders. I used to live in a place which is the adder capital of Scotland. Everybody came across them. And they're certainly poisonous. One of them killed my uncle's dog, a Labrador called Sally. Okay. And I think Sally, saw one of these beasts and she thought, ooh, what's that? I know, I'll go barking up to it and sniff at it. And it bit her on the nose and she died. But just the same, an adder is unlikely to kill an adult human being. And furthermore, as I know very well, they're quite shy. They get away from you. Of course, if a dog comes woofing up to them very quickly, they haven't got time to get away. But I've been near them several times and they're off as quick as a flash. So I think if you threw someone into a snake pit full of adders, they'd try and get out of his way. Right. Yeah, well, so I thought, I don't believe this story. I think it's been imitated from a legend from much further back in the past. So I would just write that off straight away. That's fiction. You could have a guess at why the fiction was invented, but just the same, I think that's fiction.
And another one, actually, which I could mention, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which took place on 25th September 1066, King Haraldr in Hardrade, whom we call Harald Hardrada, he was caught off guard, caught by surprise, caught without his armor, and he still, of course, fought to the death. But according to his saga, as he's fighting to the death, first he comes out with a poem because he's a famous poet himself. And then he thinks to himself, no, that wasn't a very good poem. And he comes out with another poem, which is much more complicated and technically sophisticated. Good story. But then I thought, now, hang on, who remembered that? Who remembered those poems? Who was standing close enough to hear them and get them in his head?
Right.
Because after all, in that battle, there were almost no survivors on the Viking side. They were pretty much wiped out. So I don't think that happened at all. And actually, we know for certain that the account in the saga is actually imitated. Much of the details are imitated from a much later account of a battle in the Crusader times. So the story is, much of it is fiction, and I suspect the poems were made up by the person who wrote the saga, who was himself a famous poet. There are things like that which I would say straight away, no, those must be fiction. Those are pure fiction. Several times in the book, that's exactly what I say. It's fiction, it's not fact.
Now, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of what you're working from and a lot of what everyone else is working from are things that the Vikings didn't put down themselves. So as you're doing this, are you looking into the mindset of people who are cataloging these stories 150 years later? Or do you think you're actually getting to the mindset of the people 200, 150 years earlier? Does that make sense? What is there a chicken and egg here?
Well, that's obviously a penetrating question. Let me just say one thing before I answer it.
Yes.
I said, there's bits that are pure fiction. But in recent years, there have been some very unexpected examples of archaeological corroboration.
Okay.
For instance, I told you the story about all the guys lining up to be beheaded. And about 15 miles away from here, a few years ago, they were digging a relief road for the sailing events at the Olympics. And they came upon a pit with 54 headless skeletons in it.
Wow.
And quite close by, they came upon a pit with 51 skulls. Well, they looked at the skulls, and you can identify where people come from by the isotopes in their teeth. And all these guys, they were all males. They were mostly big, heavy guys. They were all Scandinavians. So they'd been executed in a mass beheading, just like the story I told you about the Jomsvikings. And one of the really funny things is several of the victims had been beheaded from in front. Okay. Just like it said in the Jomsvikinger saga. So that doesn't mean that all the other bits of dialogue and whatnot are the same, but we can be quite sure that events of that nature took place. And there are other things like that which could be mentioned. But like I say, there's bits that are complete fiction, and there's bits where you think, we better not write that off so quickly. Right. Still, your question was about whether the sagas written, shall we say, in 1220 or something, represent attitudes of people who are living in, say, 1020. And it's a good question. And I spend quite a lot of time working out an argument about it. Briefly, I'd say this. We reckon that the Viking Age ended on 25th September 1066, when King Harald Hardrada was killed along with nearly all his army. And basically, they didn't try that again. Right. That was the end of the Viking Age. However, I don't think that was necessarily so obvious at the time. I think actually a lot of people didn't know about it, and it didn't change their behavior at all. They continued to live in the same kind of cultural world, repeating the same legends and stories and ideas and poems that they'd had all along. So actually, I would say that the Viking Age cast a long shadow, especially in Iceland, which is where most of these sagas come from, especially in Iceland, because it was isolated and also very conservative. So I think that actually, probably the mindset in Iceland in 1220 was not dissimilar from the mindset of Norway in 1020. Of course, there's one big difference, which is that Iceland had become Christian. So that affected them. Just the same, the saga literature isn't like anything else recorded from Christian Europe. It's just not like it at all.
Right.
And I think the reason for that is obviously the long kind of carryover, the long shadow of the Viking Age and the Viking mindset. That didn't go away all of a sudden.
Now, you've mentioned quite a bit their poetry, and even the story you were talking about how he was writing on the spot, if you will, or changing it up.
That's right.
There's probably a large contention of, and maybe it could be an American thing, you can tell me, but of folks who, when they see poetry or hear poetry, it's a very, it's sort of a girly thing. Like, why would I do that? You know, I have no interest in poetry. You know, it's something I've tried on this podcast to have poets on and trying to encourage, you know, an interest in poetry. But for all intents and purposes, these monsters of people seem to be very poetic.
Well, that's right. Viking poetry is not about, you know, daffodils and nightingales and that sort of stuff.
No.
And little moments of epiphany. Its main purpose, actually, is to praise the king or the ruler or the hero or the chief.
Okay.
And so it tends to be a list of battles.
Okay.
It's, I mean, we call them death songs sometimes, but they're also Ivisinger. That's life songs. It's a song which records the great deeds of the person being praised. It's praise poetry. So actually, you can see this is very popular indeed with the people who are being praised, and they feel that you know, a king really isn't worth much if he hasn't got a court skald, because the court skald is going to record his great deeds and also put them into verse which no one will ever forget. So that's what it's all about. It's particularly, you know, it's obviously, you could only say bloodthirsty poetry. But the other thing about it, and I've always been puzzled by this, is it's incredibly complicated. That poem, those two poems I mentioned by King Harald Hardrada, the first poem, I think is quite good, actually. You know, it's so good I can even remember it. But what he says, translating, is, Fram gungum ver I fylkingu, we go forward in formation, Brunju losir und blam egium, without armor against blue steel edges. Helmets shine, I don't have mine. All our gear is down by the ships. Anyway, he says this poem, which, as I say, I think is quite snappy. And then he says, no, that won't do. I'm going to do something in a really complicated stanza, which is called Drotkveit. And I've had to write out the rules of Drotkveit, because I knew for sure I would never remember them. It is in stanzas of 4 lines, which are divided into 8 half lines. Each pair of half lines must have 3 words which begin with the same letter, 2 in the first half line and 1 in the second half line. Even half lines must have half rhyme, as in Benya Manni. Even half lines must also have internal full rhyme, and these full rhymes must occur on the first or second syllable and the 4th or 5th syllable. So you've got to keep counting your syllables, you've got to keep checking your rhymes, you've got to keep checking your half rhymes, and you've got to get them right.
Right.
There's another scene in another saga where a king sets up a kind of poetry competition, and a professional skald comes on and recites a stanza of praise for the king. And the king says, nope, that won't do. You just rhymed grum and scum. Well, isn't that okay, boss? Nope, because grum only has 1 M and scum has 2. So it's not a proper rhyme and you're disqualified.
There was no Viking free verse, is what you're saying?
No, absolutely. Well said. I don't know what the opposite of free verse is, but Viking verse is extremely tightly controlled verse, and you mustn't get it wrong.
Right.
Yeah. Actually, I made a mistake in my book. I'm afraid I'm obviously never going to be a skald. I just haven't got it. But there's a scene in another saga where the famous poet Thormod Kolbrunna skald is dying on his feet. And as he dies, he composes a stanza in this difficult form about his own wound, and he dies before he gets to the last word. But he's fortunate because, as it happens, King Harold Hardrada, the great aficionado of poetry, is standing by, only a teenager, but he listens to the poem and he says something along the lines of, yeah, okay, well, that last word, it has to be 2 syllables, it has to be a verb, it has to be a half rhyme with trotha, and it has to be a full internal rhyme with chríð. Obviously, the missing word is svíða, because nothing else fits. And of course, it would help if the verb made sense, which in fact it does. So if you know the rules, well, first, you can kind of predict what the missing word is. But also, and this is quite important, if anybody remembers it wrong, someone will tell him. And that's one reason why we think that these poems, which probably were written in the Viking Age, were remembered 200 years later.
Right.
Because there's no room for variation.
Right.
You've got to get it dead right. So they are quite a useful source of information. But also, I think people have written about these for decades now, but it's still quite hard to see why they were so much appreciated. I mean, they're bloody difficult. Composing them is like trying to do a Sudoku in your head at the same time. But quite what the art is, I'm not so sure. But anyway, it's clear that this was a skill very much admired and very much practiced and very well remembered. So we still have to try to figure out quite what the appeal was. But I think you're quite right in saying it was not the appeal of free verse. And it's definitely not about daffodils. Not a daffodil is ever mentioned. Right.
It seems like Billy Collins or Shakespeare would have been thrown right out of Viking court.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think Shakespeare actually might have been able to adapt, but
right.
Just the same, yes, it's not Shakespearean at all.
Now, going through your book, one thing that I was appreciative of, I don't pay much attention to current Viking studies, but you sort of give a brief look at the layout, and I was sort of I was shocked, but I guess I shouldn't have been, to hear that there's been a new marketing campaign, it sounds like, for the Vikings, where they sound a little bit more reasonable. It sounds like they don't have the mindset that you have offered them here. What's with that?
Well, I'm afraid this is, I mentioned that people want to get away from the romantic image and create another image. And one of the ways academics have done it is to indulge in a bit of trickery. There was a book about 40 years ago, which is called The Viking Legacy, which said, what splendid people the Vikings were and how much we owed to them and all that kind of thing. And I thought, yeah, actually, what's happened here is that my academic colleagues decided they don't like Vikings much, nasty, rough people. They'd rather write about Scandinavians.
Okay.
Scandinavians, as we all know, are much nicer people. So that book, The Viking Legacy, was really, I think, about the Scandinavian legacy.
Okay.
Which, of course, is quite considerable. Yes, they were traders and they were explorers and all that kind of thing. And people sometimes ask me, well, weren't Vikings actually peaceful traders? And I say, no. The word Vikinger in Old Norse means pirate, robber, marauder. That's all it means. So if you weren't pirating and robbing and marauding, you weren't a Viking. You'd stop being a Viking. You were just another Scandinavian.
Right.
So actually, you shouldn't mix the two things up. And I'd add, actually, put it this way, most Vikings were Scandinavians, but not all of them. But most Scandinavians were not Vikings, not even part-time. So we shouldn't mix the two of them up. It's a little sleight of hand. It's a little semantic trickery, which enables people to, shall we say, it helps with producing a Mr. Nice Guy image. But I think one thing I'm quite clear about is Vikings were not Mr. Nice Guy. My old friend Patrick Wormold, he once said, would it be true to say that Vikings were mad, bad, and dangerous to know? And he said, well, they certainly weren't mad, except for one or two psychopaths of whom we have records. They weren't really bad because they had a code of honor of their own, but they were certainly dangerous to know. No question about that. So actually, the Viking image and the peaceful trader image are really quite separate from each other. And I'd add one other thing to that is, peaceful traders. Have you ever asked yourself what they were trading? The short answer is slaves.
Okay.
They were slavers. That was a large part of where the money was, frankly. I think actually in this area, the old romantic drinking out of skulls image is rather more accurate than the modern peaceful trader image.
So if we show up to the crime scene where the Viking image, that skull beer drinking Viking image is dead on the floor, what is the motive? Why do current academics, what's in it for them? Why would they do it?
Well, you are pushing me into a corner here, Jake, because, of course, if I were to reply honestly to this, I would be in serious trouble in the faculty club, and no one would talk to me ever again. But then
here comes my headline. This is what we'll headline the episode with. I'm ready.
Yeah. Well, it's quite true that we need to get a fuller picture of the Viking era, and it's only fair in that to take in for instance, the Viking urge to explore, which is obviously very considerable, and again, of which we have very good records. So no one can say that they weren't daring people who pushed the boundaries. But just the same, I think peaceful traders might turn into dangerous robbers, armed robbers, at any moment. And actually, again, I'm talking in Dorsetshire, and the first recorded Anglo-Saxon victim of a Viking raid was actually in 789, when 3 ships of Norwegians pulled in at Portland on the south coast. And the Reeve of Dorchester, which is my local county town, he very boldly rode down and attempted to collect harbor tax off them.
Wow.
He assumed they were peaceful traders, right?
Right.
So they killed him. So I think actually you could say that they might have been peaceful traders right up to the point when someone asked them for money, and then they stopped being peaceful traders.
It was a metaphor. A metaphor for today.
That's right. I'd just like to say the man's name was Beaduhard, which is Anglo-Saxon for hard battle, which tells you something about the Anglo-Saxons as well. Actually, they weren't exactly a bunch of pacifists by any means.
Right.
But that was the kind of situation, a mixed situation. You weren't quite sure whether peaceful traders or armed robbers until the moment when they made their minds up.
Right.
So, we should have a fairer picture. And I'm not denying that Vikings were also, in a way, great, urban developers who did a great deal to build up the modern town of York, and who settled in northern England and in Normandy and so on. They did lots of things which we still benefit from in a way. But behind it all, it was robbery with violence. That was the main activity.
Right. Why is it not enough just to have them stay that way in history? I mean, why is that not enough to be like, well, to allow them to essentially be, these are the people we'll never be. We don't like them. Why change it? Why do we need, it's just their move to get a better picture and they go too far?
Well, you're asking me to sort of penetrate other people's psychology in a way. I think academics are rather strange people. They're mostly rather sheltered. They don't get out much, I think they prefer to think the best of people, and they prefer to deal with people who are like themselves.
Okay.
And frankly, when I think back over my colleagues, there's not many of them I would recruit for a Viking crew. They wouldn't fit in.
Right. In the book, you put in, I assume in scare quotes, you mention a trigger warning that you offer, which I think this book is one big trigger warning, really.
It's one big trigger warning.
Yes.
You're quite right. We should have said that at the start, Jake. This is a trigger warning.
I can't imagine a people more terrifying. I mean, there are terrifying people in all ages, but especially to the psyche of today, these are full-blown monsters.
Mm. Well, all I can say is I reckon my old sergeant would have fitted into a Viking crew absolutely fine. No trouble at all. Except I think even the Vikings would have been rather careful around him. He was a dangerous fellow, yeah. No, I'm sure that there are several other people I know who would have fitted in perfectly well, but none of them actually ever turned up in the faculty club.
Right. one quick note on the names. Earlier, you mentioned Hairy Breeches. How did they? I'm sure he earned the name. Do you know in terms of how they went about naming things, naming people?
That's another good one, really. I mentioned Ragnar Lothbrok. Brok is the Norse equivalent of breeches, or in Scottish or Northern English, it would be breeks. And Loth means kind of hairy. So he was called Ragnar Hairy Trousers. Now, we don't know why. His saga says it was because he once had to save a princess from a dragon. And to save himself from dragon bite, he put on hairy trousers and rolled in wet sand, so that when the dragon bit him, it didn't get through his trousers. That, frankly, does not seem to me to be a very likely story. Well, one of the academic ladies noticed that Ragnar is probably the same person as a Viking called Regin Heros, who raided Paris in 851, I think it was, and came away with a pile of loot as well. But she pointed out that he was said to have had an attack of dysentery. And you know what happens when you have dysentery? You have continuous diarrhea.
Right.
So she suggested that perhaps they called him Lothbrok because actually he'd fouled his trousers.
That seems
and
likely.
I said, that is a theory we can immediately discount.
Okay,
because frankly, if he'd fouled his trousers, his friends, all of them with bad sense of humor, would have called him Dritbrok. And you might have to censor this, but basically Dritbrok means shit pants.
Perfect.
And yeah, they'd have called him that, and so would I, to be truthful. I have bad sense of humor as well. Look here, yes, well, all right. We perhaps better not trigger warning. Yeah. We better not develop that idea too far. But their naming habits were very often, sometimes kind of cruel, but the kind of thing only your friends can say to you. And sometimes they may have been more suggestive. I mean, one of the sons of Ragnar was Ivar hin Beinlosi, which is normally translated as Ivor the Boneless. Well, why would you call someone boneless? I don't know. But one suggestion, which I thought was quite good, is that Beinless could also mean legless. Okay. And if you're legless, what are you? You're a worm. Zoinks. And what's a worm? It's a dragon.
Right.
So perhaps they were really calling him Ivor the Dragon.
Well, that's a way cooler name than boneless, I think.
Yeah. So we all have to try and figure out. And of course, you've got someone like Haraldur in Harðræði, and that means something like Harold Harsh Counsel. But I think I would translate it as Hardline Harold.
Okay.
You're not going to get a soft answer from him.
Okay.
You only get a tough answer from him. And this, of course, is kind of admiring. Or you might get a name like the Vikings called their enemy, the Anglo-Saxon King Edmund. They called him Jarnsida, which means Ironside, because he didn't give up.
Right. Now, Tom, I have to ask, we talked a little bit about how this is not quite up to the taste of most academics. You know, there's been a move to sort of sand the edges of these guys. Who are you that this is, you mentioned you have a bad sense of humor yourself. Who are you? Can you introduce us to yourself?
Oh, well, yeah, good question, actually. The guy who wrote that book, The Viking Legacy, 40 years ago, I was talking about something about Anglo-Saxon, actually, in a conference in Denmark, and he obviously didn't like it. And he got up and he said he had a question. And the question was, who are you? Who is the lecturer? And I looked down my nose at him, and I have a big Scandinavian nose to look down. And I said, well, I have a question too. Which institution does the questioner represent? And he said, University College London. And I said, London. They have a university there. Goodness me. Of course, I was from Oxford. So I was looking down my nose at him and generally sneering at him. But I guess, what can I say? You know, I went to Cambridge, not Oxford. I've lectured at or been a professor at 6 different universities, 3 in England and 3 in America. And I can look down my nose at anybody, frankly. I don't care. But I think he was just cross because I hadn't done a PhD in Old Norse studies under his direction. And
Okay.
he thought he really had the right to decide who was an authority and who wasn't. But I don't make any claims like that. I've just read a great deal of it.
You're like a Robin Hood Viking going about, a good guy, but
yes.
robbing, but a good guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing, and I mean this quite seriously, if you want to be a professor in medieval literature, I think it's very important to engage with the general public. Because if you don't engage with the general public, they'll lose interest in you. And if they lose interest in you, then you won't have any students. And pretty soon you won't have a job either. So it is vitally important, I think, to build on what people already recognize. And if there's two things in the medieval world which still have a brand image in the modern world, it's Vikings and King Arthur. And academics don't like to talk about either of them. Well, they should. They should. It's absolutely vital, I think, to talk to people outside the faculty club.
Has that been something in your academic career that you've made sure to do? What does that look like for you?
Well, you talk about Tolkien fighting the long defeat.
Right.
That's what he talks about. And of course, he meant his own life, actually. His long defeat was trying to rescue medieval literature from the continuous competition of modern literature. And he thought it was vitally important to study medieval literature and medieval language, and especially Icelandic, which he was very, very fond of. And I entirely agree with him. That's what we should do. But in these days, actually, that's the kind of thing that gets chucked off university syllabuses. They don't do that sort of thing anymore. Well, that's a mistake, because in the end, as I say, universities depend on the general public. And if the general public loses interest in them, which it seems they are doing, then you have no future.
Right. Now, I would be remiss. We mentioned earlier that you are a Tolkien scholar as well. You had the opportunity to meet Professor Tolkien, correct?
Yes, that's right. A long time ago. Well, of course, it's a long time ago, because he died in January 1973. I got my Oxford job in September 1972.
Okay.
So I only was in Oxford with Tolkien in the last 3 or 4 months of his life.
Okay.
But yes, I did have quite a long conversation with him. And of course, there's a sort of fellow feeling, because we both went to the same school, King Edward School in Birmingham. And Tolkien knew who I was already, because, kind of kept in touch with things. But also, we used to play for the same rugby team, which was Old Edwardians. Tolkien only played a few times, and I played for 7 seasons. But that was another kind of bond, you might say, between us.
Sure. What was that? Can I ask about how it went? I imagine that were you already a fan of his work at the time?
Oh, yeah, sure. Some years before, I'd given a talk about him at a little day conference in Birmingham, and his secretary was there. And she asked for the script. And of course, in those days, we didn't have computers. So I gave her a carbon copy of my script, and she gave it to Tolkien, and he wrote me a very nice letter about it, which I've still got, of course, framed.
Of course.
So, as I say, he was aware of me, and of course, I was very well aware of him. But we had a very nice conversation. But I didn't like to try and interview him.
Sure.
Because he'd been interviewed so many times already. So we just had a little Hobbit-style chatter about the old school and the old rugby team. And, he listened quite interestedly while I ran through the fixture list and the team sheet. And he was listening to me, because he thought, the guys I was talking about, who I played with, were they the grandchildren of people he knew?
Right.
Well, probably they were.
Right. Now, if he fought the long defeat in terms of medieval studies, would you describe your career similarly? How would you talk about your career?
Well, you bet. Absolutely the same. I spent most of my career as a professor of English language and medieval literature, trying to protect some vestige of the syllabus from the insistent demands that it should be closed down.
How did that go?
Pretty badly. I was always outnumbered. On the other hand, I was quite sneaky about it. I would always try and work out a syllabus in which many subjects were optional.
Okay.
Because I was quite sure I could get an audience for Viking sagas in translation, right, or medieval romance or something like that. No trouble at all. The students turned up and they were very interested. But many of my colleagues just wanted to, just abolish it all. And that's what Tolkien thought too. So it really was a case of, I won't say a long defeat, but it was a long rearguard action.
Now, you mentioned that it was sort of crucial for folks in that world to be talking with people outside of the classroom. If it didn't go so hot within the academic world, are you encouraged by how your work has been received outside of the classroom?
Yeah, sure I am. I mean, it's not hard to measure. One of the questions is, okay, what's your print run? Most academic books these days.
Sure.
They print 250 copies. They sell them for $100 a time or worse, maybe $200. And who buys them? Nobody. Only research libraries. And even they're getting a bit sticky about it when it comes to that sort of price. Whereas I don't know how many copies I sold of The Road to Middle-earth.
Right.
Probably 100,000.
Right.
And as for Tolkien, well, I can only laugh when I think how many copies he sold. Nobody knows.
Right.
Nobody has the faintest idea. Many millions. Many, many millions. So Tolkien did exactly the right thing. He appealed over the heads of the academic world to the general reading public, and he was totally successful, and they've never forgiven him for it.
Wow. All right, Mr. Shippey, thank you so much. I've taken more of your time than I asked for. I really appreciate your time. And where do you want folks to find you? Is there a place you want to send them?
Well, I'd really like them to buy the remaining copies of my print run, because if they buy them all, then we'll have a paperback edition.
There you go.
And I intend to write a short and snooty preface to that, being rude again about my academic colleagues, former colleagues. So yeah, buy the book by all means. If you want to look me up, what you could do is Google Tom Shippey plus, and you've got to get this right, Arts and Sciences, St. Louis. And you see my kind of biography there. And actually, another thing, it just crosses my mind. You could go to the website, which is academia.edu, and you'll see quite a lot of my stuff there. Go into the website, put Tom Shippey in the search button, and quite a lot of stuff will pop up which might interest you.
Perfect. All right, everyone. Laughing Shall I Die is the title of the book. Go get it so we can get that other print run and that snappy preface. Cheers. Thank you so much.
Thanks.